Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a marble bench, wrapping ourselves in a slightly damp linen towel, and stepping into a place that the ancient Romans considered so essential to daily life that they built over 900 of them in a single city, the Roman bathhouse. Not the serene, candlelit spa experience your imagination might be assembling right now with soft music and someone whispering about essential oils. I mean the real thing. Crowded, loud, faintly smelling of olive oil and wet stone, and the particular combination of 1,000 people doing very human things in a very enclosed space. A place where senators and slaves showed up on the same afternoon, where business deals were made in rooms that had no business being used for business, and where the concept of personal space was treated as a philosophical curiosity rather than a practical consideration. So before we get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. A sincere thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to this channel. I read your comments, I read your suggestions, and I am consistently moved by the fact that people all over the world are choosing to end their day here, in this quiet corner of history, where the lights are low and the past is doing most of the talking. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always some unreasonable hour somewhere, and I am always honored to be the last voice you hear before everything goes quiet. Now, if you haven't already, dim the lights, put your phone face down after you press play, pull something warm over yourself, let your shoulders drop, and let's go back about 2,000 years to a civilization that understood, perhaps better than any other in the ancient world, that the act of getting clean was never really just about getting clean. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to walk into a Roman bathhouse on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon? What the air smelled like the moment you stepped through the door, what sounds surrounded you, and what those sounds told you about the kind of place you had just entered? Did the wealthy Romans have a better experience, or did the crowds swallow everyone equally? What happened in the rooms nobody talks about in the history textbooks? Who built the fires that kept the water hot, and what was their day like? And what did it mean in a city of 1 million people to have a place you could go every single day that cost almost nothing and gave you back for an hour or two the feeling that the world was a manageable place? Congratulations, you have just arrived in Rome. The year is somewhere around 50 AD, give or take a decade, and it doesn't particularly matter which decade because the scene you're about to walk into has been essentially continuous for 200 years and will remain essentially continuous for 200 more. You are standing outside the entrance to a public bathhouse, a Thermae if it is one of the large Imperial complexes, a Balnae if it is one of the smaller neighborhood establishments that outnumber the large ones by a considerable margin. The building in front of you is larger than you expected. The door is already open. Someone is going in ahead of you. Someone is coming out behind them, hair still damp, looking considerably more relaxed than they did an hour ago. From inside, you can hear the echo of water and voices and the particular acoustic quality of a large stone room full of people doing ordinary things. You have a small coin in your hand, or possibly no coin at all if it is one of the days when admission is free, which happens more often than you might expect, in a city whose emperors understood that happy citizens are considerably easier to manage than unhappy ones. You go in. Welcome to the Roman bathhouse. Try the cold pool. Or don't. The water is genuinely cold, and nobody's going to pretend otherwise. The story of how Rome ended up with 900 bathhouses in a single city, and why ordinary working people considered a daily visit as unremarkable and necessary as eating, begins not with Rome at all, but with the Greeks, which is where a surprising number of Roman stories begin, usually with the Romans taking something Greek, making it considerably larger, adding more marble, and then claiming they invented it. The Greek Gymnasium was the original institution, a place for athletic exercise, communal washing, and the kind of philosophical conversation that apparently went better when everyone was slightly out of breath and damp. The Greeks had cold baths attached to their gymnasia, functional, minimal, architecturally unambitious. You exercised, you washed off the evidence of exercising, you went home. The ritual was practical. The architecture reflected this. Nobody was lingering. The Romans looked at this arrangement and had what was, depending on your perspective, either a genuinely inspired thought or a catastrophic one. What if instead of cold water, the water was hot? And what if instead of a small functional room attached to a gymnasium, you built an entire complex dedicated specifically to the experience of bathing, with multiple pools at multiple temperatures, and heated floors and rooms for massage, and spaces for socializing, and a library perhaps, and food vendors outside, and exercise courts attached, and gardens, and maybe a small theater? What if the bath was not something you did before the main event of your afternoon, but was itself the main event? What if it was the center of daily life rather than a footnote to it? This thought, or series of thoughts, unfolded gradually over several centuries, which is the honest way that most genuinely transformative ideas unfold, rather than the dramatic single moment of inspiration that makes for better storytelling. The earliest Roman baths were simple structures, stone tanks of water, heated imperfectly by whatever was available, used by people who had been exercising in the nearby open-air spaces and needed somewhere to wash afterward. They appeared in Rome sometime around the 3rd century BC, which places them in an era when Rome was still a regional power rather than the imperial colossus it would become, and when the infrastructure of the city reflected that more modest ambition. These early baths were nothing that would have impressed anyone. They would not have inspired poetry or architectural admiration or the particular kind of Roman pride that later bathhouses would generate in enormous quantities. They were just tanks of water, warmer than the river, cheaper than going home. They did the job. What changed everything, or began to change everything, was the development of the Hypocaust system, which is one of those pieces of ancient engineering that sounds complicated and is in fact elegant in the specific way that solutions to obvious problems tend to be elegant once someone has thought of them. The Hypocaust was underfloor heating. The floor of the bathing room was raised on a series of small pillars, creating a hollow space beneath it. And through that space, hot air was circulated from a furnace. The floor above became warm. The walls, which were also hollow and connected to the same system, became warm. The room itself became warm. The water in the room became warm and stayed warm, which was the point, and which seems like a modest achievement until you consider that maintaining a large volume of water at a consistent, comfortable temperature in an era before electricity or gas or any of the other mechanisms we take for granted is an engineering problem that requires a genuine and non-trivial solution. The Hypocaust was that solution, and its invention, which happened somewhere around the 1st century BC and is attributed with varying degrees of certainty to a man named Gaius Sergius Orata, who was by all accounts a person of considerable practical ingenuity and also, interestingly, a successful seller of oysters, which is the kind of biographical detail that history occasionally produces to remind you that the people who shaped civilization were also just people with miscellaneous careers, changed Roman bathing permanently. With underfloor heating, the bath could be genuinely warm regardless of the season. You did not need to be in a Mediterranean summer to have a hot bath. You needed a furnace and someone to keep it burning, and an architectural system that distributed the heat efficiently, all of which Rome had the resources to provide at a scale that no previous civilization had attempted. The first truly large public bathhouse in Rome was built by Agrippa, the great general and close associate of the Emperor Augustus, sometime around 25 BC. Agrippa's baths stood in the Campus Martius, the large open field to the northwest of the city center that had historically been used for military exercises and was by this period increasingly being built up with public monuments and amenities. Agrippa's bathhouse was not the largest ever built in Rome. That distinction would belong to the great imperial complexes of later centuries, but it was large enough and public enough and free enough. Agrippa apparently paid for admission himself and maintained this arrangement for some time to establish a template. The large, publicly accessible, architecturally ambitious bathhouse as a civic institution was now a Roman idea, and once it was a Roman idea, it spread with the efficiency that characterizes Roman ideas that also happen to be very good ones.
Augustus, who understood the politics of public amenity as well as anyone who ever held power, continued in this direction. His vision of Rome as a city transformed from brick to marble included the bathhouse as a component of that transformation, a physical demonstration of what organized civilization could provide to ordinary people. The bathhouse said something about Rome that the Forum and the Temple and the amphitheater also said, but said in a different register, more intimate, more daily, more embedded in the actual texture of how people lived. The Temple said something about Rome's relationship with the divine. The Forum said something about Rome's relationship with commerce and law. The bathhouse said something about Rome's relationship with its own citizens, which was that it would provide them, at minimal cost, with the infrastructure of a decent daily life. This was politics, obviously. It was also, in a straightforward practical sense, genuinely useful, and the two things coexisted without contradiction.
By the time of the Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, and about whom history has a great deal to say on a variety of subjects, public bathing in Rome had become so thoroughly embedded in daily routine that its absence was essentially unthinkable. Nero built his own baths, as emperors were by this point expected to do, and they were reportedly lavish in the specific way that Nero's projects tended toward lavish, which is to say, excessive in ways that impressed some people and horrified others, and ultimately contributed to a general impression of an emperor who had lost his sense of proportion, which, in the context of Nero's full biography, is perhaps the mildest of the criticisms available. But the baths themselves, regardless of the excesses of their construction, were used. People went. The routine continued. The great age of the Imperial bathhouses came in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, with the construction of the baths of Caracalla and later the baths of Diocletian, complexes so enormous that the word bathhouse seems entirely inadequate to describe them. The baths of Caracalla, built between approximately 212 and 216 AD under the Emperor Caracalla, whose actual name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus and who adopted the nickname from a style of Gallic cloak he favored, could accommodate somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 bathers simultaneously. 6,000 people in a single building, bathing. This number requires a moment of consideration because it is not a small number of people doing a private thing. It is a small city's worth of people doing a shared thing, and the architecture that contained them was built to a scale that acknowledged this fact without apology. The complex covered about 27 acres, which is larger than many modern city blocks, and included not just the bathing halls, which were themselves enormous, but also libraries, one in Greek and one in Latin, because Rome's educated classes were expected to be bilingual, and the bathhouse was among other things an intellectual space, exercise courts, gardens, shops, meeting rooms, and a cistern capable of holding an amount of water that required a dedicated aqueduct branch to supply. The baths of Caracalla were fed by their own aqueduct. This is the kind of logistical commitment that tells you something about how seriously Rome took the institution of public bathing. You do not build an aqueduct for something you consider optional. The baths of Diocletian, constructed around 298 to 306 AD and capable of holding up to 3,000 bathers, were, if anything, even larger in overall footprint, covering nearly 32 acres. They stood in the northeastern part of the city and remained in use for several centuries after their construction, long past the period when the Western Roman Empire as a political entity had ceased to exist, which tells you something about the durability of the institution relative to the political structures that built it. The building itself, or parts of it, still stands in Rome today. Michelangelo, working about 1,200 years after the baths were built, converted part of the structure into a church, the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli, which remains in use and in which you can still see the vast scale of the original Roman construction, the height of the vaulted ceilings, the thickness of the walls, the sheer ambition of a building designed to hold thousands of people and to hold them comfortably.
This is what Rome built when it decided that public bathing was a civic priority, not a room with some warm water, an institution with its own aqueduct and its own library and gardens large enough to walk in and heights high enough to make you feel, standing under them, that the civilization that produced this building had thought carefully about what human beings needed and had decided that what they needed included not just warmth and water, but space and beauty and the quiet dignity of a building that took their daily lives seriously. The neighborhood balnea were the other end of this spectrum, and they were in many ways the more important part of the story of Roman bathing, because they were the part that most Romans actually experienced most days. The great Imperial Thermae were impressive and available, but they were not on every corner. The small neighborhood bathhouses were. By the height of the imperial period, the city of Rome contained somewhere between 800 and 900 of these smaller establishments, distributed through the residential neighborhoods of the city, with a density that suggests they were considered infrastructure in the way we consider water mains infrastructure. Not a luxury, not an amenity, but a basic functional component of how the city operated.
The neighborhood balnea was a smaller, more intimate, more variable institution than the imperial counterparts. Some were well appointed, with decent facilities and reasonably clean pools, and an operator who took some pride in the establishment. Others were cramped, poorly maintained, expensive relative to their quality, and patronized primarily by people who had no better option nearby. The variation was significant and depended heavily on the neighborhood, the owner, the competition from nearby establishments, and the general economic condition of the area. A balnea in a prosperous neighborhood near the Forum operated differently from one in the dense, chaotic residential districts of the Aventine, or the Subura, where the buildings were tall and the streets were narrow and the population density was extraordinary, even by the standards of a city accustomed to being crowded. What they shared, regardless of quality or location, was the basic function and the basic rhythm. They opened in the late morning, typically around the first hour after noon by our reckoning, and they closed at sunset or somewhat after sunset in the establishments that could afford to keep the lamps burning. They charged a small fee, typically 1 quadrans, which was the smallest denomination of Roman coin, worth 1/4 of an os, which was itself not a large unit of value. The fee was small enough that it was within the reach of most working Romans, and on days when admission was reduced or waived by a wealthy patron celebrating a personal occasion or a public holiday, it was within the reach of essentially everyone. This accessibility was not accidental. It was a feature of the institution, a deliberate characteristic maintained by a combination of civic policy and social expectation. The bath was supposed to be available to ordinary people. Emperors who wanted to be popular, which was most emperors, understood this and behaved accordingly. The water that filled the pools of both the great Thermae and the smaller balnea came from Rome's extraordinary aqueduct system, one of the genuine engineering achievements of the ancient world, and a subject that deserves its own long, slow, late-night exploration at some future point. By the height of the imperial period, Rome was served by 11 major aqueducts, delivering water to the city at a rate that modern estimates place at somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion liters per day, which works out to somewhere between 500 and 1,000 liters per person per day in a city of approximately 1 million people. For comparison, average daily water use per person in a modern developed city is typically somewhere between 1 and 200 liters. Rome was, by this measure, a city drowning in water, and the bathhouses were one of the primary consumers of that extraordinary supply. The water arrived at the bathhouses via dedicated branch lines from the main aqueduct channels, and it moved through the bathing complex in a continuous flow, entering the pools clean and exiting them through drainage channels into the city's sewer system, which was itself a considerable engineering achievement, and a subject that ancient Romans were considerably more pragmatic about than modern sensibilities might prefer. The flow was not always perfectly continuous, and the pools were not always perfectly clean, which is a complication we will return to in more detail later, because the reality of what was actually in the water is one of those historical details that tends to produce a specific expression on the faces of people who find out about it. But the principle was sound, and the delivery was generally reliable, which, in a city of 1 million people, represents a logistical accomplishment that deserves more credit than it typically receives. The wood that fueled the furnaces of Rome's bathhouses was another logistical challenge of considerable scale. Each bathhouse required a continuous supply of fuel to keep its hypocaust system running through the operating hours of the day. And the fuel was wood, because Rome had not discovered any alternative, and wood came from forests that were increasingly not nearby as the centuries of Roman construction and heating and cooking worked their way through the available timber in the immediate region. The wood supply for Rome's bathhouses, multiplied across 800 or 900 establishments, all running their furnaces simultaneously through the afternoon, represents a quantity of wood that is genuinely difficult to visualize and that had real consequences for the forests of central Italy over the long run. Roman officials who managed the city's wood supply were not unaware of this problem. They were aware of it in the way that people tend to be aware of resource problems that are real and serious, but not yet immediate enough to require the kind of action that would be genuinely inconvenient. The furnaces kept burning.
The men who ran those furnaces, who we will spend more time with later in this exploration, were among the least visible and most essential workers in the Roman bath economy, which is a category of worker that tends to recur throughout history with a consistency that suggests something fundamental about how human societies organize themselves around the labor they would prefer not to think about too carefully. They fed the fire heated the floor warmed the room allowed the bath to be what it was. And what it was something that a Roman of any class, on an ordinary afternoon in any year between roughly 100 BC and 400 AD, considered as natural and necessary as eating. A place to go, a place that was warm, a place where the city, in all its noise and commerce and ambition and difficulty, was briefly held at a small distance by the simple physical fact of hot water and stone walls and the sound of other people, also warm, also briefly held, making the ordinary sounds of human beings who are, for the moment, somewhere they intended to be. That's where we are. That's what we've just walked into. The furnace is already burning, the floor is warm under your feet, the water is waiting, and we have barely started. If you have ever stood inside a very large, very old building and felt something shift in your chest, some combination of smallness and wonder that has no precise name in English, but that every human being recognizes immediately upon experiencing it, then you have some preparation for what walking into the main hall of a Roman bathhouse felt like. Not the neighborhood balnea around the corner from your apartment, though that had its own functional dignity. The great Thermae, the ones built by emperors who understood that architecture was a political argument made in stone, and that the argument needed to be loud enough to be heard across centuries. The ceiling above you in the main bathing hall of the Baths of Caracalla was approximately 38 meters high. 38 meters. That is roughly the height of a 12-story modern building. Above you, a vaulted ceiling of concrete and brick, decorated with mosaics and painted plaster, spanning a room wide enough to make the people at the other end of it look small and distant. The floor beneath your feet was marble, laid in geometric patterns of different colored stone, red and green and white and black, fitted together with a precision that made the surface feel almost impossibly intentional, as though the floor had grown that way naturally rather than been assembled by human hands over years of patient labor. The walls held niches containing statues. The light came from enormous windows set high in the walls, windows large enough to flood the interior with the particular quality of Mediterranean afternoon light that makes everything it touches look slightly more significant than it actually is. This was not accidental. None of it was accidental. The Roman architect who designed a public bathhouse was working within a set of aesthetic and functional requirements that had been refined over generations, and the result was a building type so thoroughly thought through that its basic logic remained essentially unchanged for 4 centuries. Understanding the architecture of the Roman bathhouse means understanding not just what the buildings looked like, but why they looked that way, and what the design was intended to do to the people inside it. Because the Roman bathhouse was, among other things, a piece of applied psychology built from concrete and marble. It told you where to go, how long to stay, and how to feel about being there. And it did this with a sophistication that is worth taking seriously even now, 2,000 years later, sitting in your considerably warmer and considerably more private bathing arrangement, about to fall asleep. The standard large Thermae followed a layout that was symmetrical in a way that feels almost compulsive when you look at it from above. The central axis of the building ran from the main entrance through a series of rooms of increasing temperature and then back out the other side, and the entire complex was mirrored left and right along this axis with a precision that suggests the Romans had strong feelings about bilateral symmetry and were not shy about expressing them architecturally. This symmetricalness was not merely decorative, it was functional. A bathhouse that could be entered from either side, that had duplicate facilities on both sides of its central axis, could process twice the number of people that a single-sided facility could manage, which in a city where your bathhouse might serve several thousand people on a busy afternoon was a practical consideration of the first order. The sequence of rooms in a Roman bathhouse followed a progression that was both logical and deliberate. You entered through the apoderium, the changing room, where you removed your clothing and left it in the care of a slave or a paid attendant, or in the smaller neighborhood establishments, simply left it in an alcove and hoped for the best, which was an optimism that Roman pickpockets consistently rewarded with disappointment. The apoderium was not a room designed to impress. It was a transitional space, functional, adequately lit, lined with niches or shelves for clothing and personal belongings, populated with people in various stages of undress, with the unself-conscious practicality of a culture that did not attach the same symbolic weight to physical exposure that later centuries would develop. You left your clothes, you went in. This was the agreement. From the apoderium, you moved into the sequence of heated rooms that formed the thermal core of the bathhouse experience. The first of these was typically the tepidarium, the warm room, which served as a transitional environment between the outside temperature and the more extreme heat of the rooms beyond.
The tepidarium was heated to a moderate warmth, comfortable without being challenging, the room where you began the process of acclimatization that the full bathing sequence required. It was often also the room where people spent the most time, not because it was the most dramatic thermal experience available, but because it was the most comfortable, the easiest to remain in, the room where conversation happened most naturally. The tepidarium was the living room of the bathhouse, if the bathhouse had a living room, which in social and functional terms it essentially did. Beyond the tepidarium lay the caldarium, the hot room, which was the thermal climax of the bathing sequence, and the room that the Hypocaust system was most aggressively dedicated to heating. The caldarium was hot in a way that required adjustment, a dry, penetrating heat that opened the pores and loosened the muscles and produced in most people, after the first few minutes, a state of physical relaxation that had practical value in a city where physical labor was the daily reality for most of the population. The caldarium typically contained a hot water pool, the alveus, usually rectangular, set into the floor or slightly raised, large enough for multiple bathers simultaneously, and a labrum, a large basin of cold water mounted on a pedestal, from which you could splash yourself when the heat became too much. The contrast between the hot air of the room and the cold water of the labrum was deliberate. The shock of cold water on heated skin was considered beneficial, both physically and, in some formulations, spiritually, and the labrum provided it in a controlled and socially accepted context. The laconicum was the most extreme room in the thermal sequence, a dry heat chamber, analogous in function, if not in precise design, to a modern sauna.
heated to temperatures that ancient sources describe as very great, and that modern estimates place at somewhere between 50 and 70 degrees Celsius. Not all bathhouses had a laconicum. The smaller neighborhood establishments often dispensed with it, either because the space was not available or because the additional fuel cost was not justified by the demand. But the larger thermae typically included one, and it was used by people who either had a high tolerance for heat or had been told by someone whose opinion they respected that extreme heat was good for their health, which in Rome, as in every subsequent era, was a belief maintained with great enthusiasm and mixed empirical support. The frigidarium was the cold room, and in the great thermae it was often the architecturally most impressive space in the entire complex. The frigidarium of the baths of Caracalla, for example, was a room of extraordinary dimensions, its vaulted ceiling rising to heights that made the space feel more like a cathedral than a bathing room, which is not an accidental comparison, given that the architects of early Christian cathedrals were working in a tradition that had been shaped in part by exactly these spaces. The frigidarium contained the cold plunge pool, which was large, often very large, sometimes large enough to swim in rather than merely to stand in, and filled with water that was cold in the specific way that water fed by an aqueduct in a stone building is cold, regardless of the season. The transition from the heat of the caldarium to the cold of the frigidarium was the thermal shock that completed the bathing sequence, the moment that Romans believed opened the pores and then closed them, and left the skin clean and the body invigorated, and the mind, if you were inclined towards such assessments, clearer than it had been before. The natatio was the outdoor swimming pool, present in the great thermae and absent in most of the smaller balnea, a large open-air pool that sat at one end of the complex and was used primarily for exercise and recreation rather than for the ritual bathing sequence. The natatio of the baths of Caracalla measured approximately 50 by 22 meters, which is to say it was a serious swimming pool by any standard, large enough for genuine athletic use, open to the sky, and in good weather presumably the most pleasant space in the entire complex. It was here that Roman gentlemen could demonstrate their swimming ability, which was considered a basic component of physical education alongside reading and arithmetic, and where the bathhouse became most obviously a place of recreation rather than merely of hygiene. The palaestra was the exercise court, typically an open courtyard flanked by colonnaded walkways, where bathers could engage in the physical exercise that Roman bathing culture considered a necessary precursor to the bath itself. You did not simply arrive at the bathhouse and get into the water. The correct sequence, as understood by Roman medical writers and social convention, involved exercise first, the production of sweat and the elevation of body temperature, followed by the bathing sequence, which then cleaned the results of the exercise and brought the body back to a resting state. The palaestra was where the exercise happened, and the activities that took place there ranged from the formal and organized, ball games, wrestling, running, to the informal and sociable, which is a category that in the Roman context covered a considerable range of behavior. The materials from which all of this was built deserve attention because they tell you something about the Roman approach to construction that is as impressive in its way as the scale of the buildings themselves. Roman concrete, opus cementicium, was the enabling technology of the great bathhouses, the material that made it possible to span the enormous vaulted spaces that define the character of these buildings. Roman concrete was made from a mixture of lime, volcanic ash called pozzolana, and aggregate, and it had properties that modern materials scientists have spent considerable effort trying to understand and replicate, including a remarkable resistance to cracking under the stresses of large-span vaulted construction, and a durability that is demonstrated rather conclusively by the fact that portions of Roman concrete structures are still standing after 2,000 years of weather and earthquake and the general hostility of time.
The vaulted ceilings that this material made possible were not merely impressive, they were structurally revolutionary. A flat ceiling can only span so far before it requires intermediate supports, columns or walls that break up the space beneath it. A vault transfers its loads differently, directing them outward and downward into the walls and buttresses that contain them, and in doing so allows the space beneath to remain open and column-free in a way that a flat ceiling cannot. The great halls of the Roman Thermae were open because their vaulted ceilings made them open, and the openness was both aesthetically deliberate and practically necessary. A room that needed to hold thousands of people required a floor plan unobstructed by columns, and the vault provided it. The marble that covered the floors and the lower portions of the walls was not merely decorative, though it was certainly that. Marble is a dense, non-porous stone that does not absorb water and can be cleaned without difficulty, which made it functionally excellent for a wet environment in which the surfaces were in constant contact with water and with large numbers of human bodies. The patterns in which the marble was laid, opus sectile for the decorative floor panels, simpler geometric arrangements for the larger areas, reflected a Roman aesthetic preference for geometric order expressed in material richness, the idea that beauty and function were not competing values but complementary ones, and that a floor could be both easy to clean and genuinely beautiful without contradiction. This attitude toward the relationship between beauty and function is one of the things that makes Roman architecture feel, even to a modern eye, fundamentally serious. They were not decorating their buildings, they were building their decorations into the structure itself. The windows of the great Thermae were an engineering achievement that tends to get less attention than the vaults or the concrete, but deserves equal consideration. The large window openings in the upper walls of the bathing halls were glazed in the sense that they contained some form of transparent or translucent material to keep out the weather while admitting light, though what that material was and how it was fitted varies by period and establishment. Thin sheets of translucent stone, particularly a mineral called lapis specularis, a form of selenite that could be split into thin sheets with some degree of transparency, were used in some contexts. Window glass was known and used in the Roman period, though it was considerably less clear and considerably more expensive than the glass we are accustomed to, more of a greenish, translucent material than a transparent one. The windows of the caldarium and tepidarium were typically oriented to the southwest or west to capture the afternoon sun during the hours when the bathhouse was most actively used, a detail that speaks to a sophisticated understanding of passive Solon design that would not be rediscovered in European architecture for many centuries after the fall of Rome. The heating system, the suspensura, the raised floor supported on columns of brick or tile, needed to be constructed to tolerances that would keep it level and stable under the weight of the marble above it and the people above that, while maintaining the open space below for the circulation of hot air. The columns, called pilae, were typically made of stacked square tiles, each about 20 centimeters on a side, built up to a height of about 60 centimeters, spaced at regular intervals of about 60 centimeters in each direction across the floor area. Above them sat the floor itself, constructed of large tiles laid across the tops of the columns and then covered with a finishing layer of concrete and marble. Beneath everything, the hot air moved from the furnace mouth through the space under the floor and up through hollow box tiles built into the walls, tubuli, which carried the heat up the walls and eventually out through vents near the ceiling, warming the room from both below and from all four sides simultaneously. This system was effective in ways that should not be taken for granted. Maintaining a large room at a comfortable bathing temperature in a stone building in a Mediterranean climate requires a continuous and carefully managed heat input, and the Romans achieved this without any of the control mechanisms that modern heating systems take for granted. No thermostats, no automated fuel feed, no pressure regulation. The temperature of the bathing rooms was managed entirely by the judgment of the stoker, the slave or worker whose job was to tend the furnace and regulate the fire based on the temperature of the rooms above and the complaints of the bathers, which were apparently frequent and specific, and formed part of the ambient noise of the bathing experience, in much the same way that comments about the coffee were part of the ambient noise of the 1950s American diner, continuous, varied, and addressed with the patient professionalism of someone who had heard it all before and would hear it all again tomorrow.
The great Thermae also contained spaces that were not directly related to bathing at all, and their presence tells you something about the ambition of the institution and the range of activities it was expected to support. The libraries already mentioned were not incidental. They were designed spaces, properly fitted out, with niches for book rolls, which is the form books took in this period, and with reading rooms attached, and they were stocked with actual books that actual people actually read. The idea that a bathhouse should contain a library is one that sounds eccentric to a modern ear, but within the Roman conception of what a bathhouse was for, it's completely logical. The bathhouse was a space for the improvement of the whole person, physical and intellectual, and the library served the intellectual component of that improvement in the same way that the palestra served the physical component. You exercised, you bathed, you read. The sequence made sense to people who had grown up with it, and its logic is not entirely lost even to people who grew up with none of it.
The gardens that surrounded, and in some cases penetrated, the great Thermae complexes were similarly not decorative add-ons but integral components of the experience. The garden spaces provided outdoor areas for walking and conversation and the kind of purposeless but socially valuable time spending that every functional society needs to accommodate somewhere. They were planted with trees that provided shade in summer and with flowers that provided, in the ancient sources, a pleasant scent that the interior of the bathhouse, for reasons we will discuss later, was not always in a position to provide for itself. The gardens also provided space for the vendors and entertainers who gathered outside and sometimes inside the great Thermae, selling food and drink and other services to the bathers, creating around the edge of the formal architectural complex a less formal zone of commercial activity that gave the whole establishment something of the character of a market or a festival ground alongside its character as a bathing facility. The aesthetic program of the great Thermae, the statues in their niches, the mosaics on the floors and the lower walls, the painted plaster on the upper walls and ceilings, was not separate from the architecture, but was its completion. Roman art in public buildings was not hung on walls as an afterthought, it was built into the walls as part of the original design. And the great bathhouses were among the most elaborately decorated public buildings in Rome, second perhaps only to the great temples and the imperial palaces. The statue program of the baths of Caracalla alone was extraordinary. Sculptures recovered from the site over the centuries of archaeological excavation include some of the most famous works in the collections of major European museums, the Farnese Hercules, the Farnese Bull, a series of figures that in their original context stood in the niches of the bathing halls and presided over the daily activity of thousands of bathers with the serene indifference of beings who are accustomed to being observed from below. The choice of subjects for the statuary program was not random. Athletes and heroes predominated, figures whose physical perfection was appropriate to a context dedicated to the care and exercise of the body. Hercules appeared frequently, not merely because he was a popular subject in Roman art generally, but because his mythological identity as a figure of extraordinary physical power and endurance made him particularly apt in a space devoted to physical improvement. The presence of these figures in the bathing halls was a constant visual argument for the value of the institution and the dignity of what happened within it. You were not merely washing yourself, you were participating in a tradition of physical cultivation that went back to the heroes of myth. The architecture said so, the statues confirmed it, the floor beneath your feet, laid in marble patterns of considerable beauty and considerable expense, agreed. The neighborhood balnea operated within this architectural logic, but at a scale that required constant compromise. The small bathhouse on a side street in the Subura could not have a natatio or a library or gardens or statues of Hercules. It had what space and budget allowed, which was typically a changing room, a tepidarium, a caldarium, and if the owner was ambitious or the neighborhood was prosperous, a small cold plunge pool. The floor might be simple mosaic rather than marble opus sectile. The walls might be painted plaster rather than marble veneer. The ceiling might be a simple barrel vault rather than the complex groin vaults of the great Thermae. But the logic was the same: the progression from cool to warm to hot, the movement through a sequence of spaces designed to do specific things to your body and your mood, the return to the changing room at the end feeling, if the establishment had done its job correctly, better than you had when you arrived. The architectural achievement of the Roman bathhouse is in the end inseparable from the social achievement it supported. The building was designed to do something to the people inside it, to make them feel, through the combined effect of scale and material and light and warmth, that they were somewhere worth being, that the act of caring for their bodies was an act of sufficient dignity to justify a building of this ambition, that Rome, which had given them this, had given them something real. The emperor who built the bathhouse understood this, the architect who designed it understood this, and the ordinary Roman who walked through the door on an ordinary afternoon, who had spent the morning at work and had the afternoon to himself, who came here not because it was impressive, though it was, but because it was warm and it was free, and it was the place you went. He understood it too, in the way you understand things that are simply part of how the world works, without needing to articulate why or how. The building did its work. He went in. The marble was cool under his feet before the floor warmed it. The light came through the high windows at an angle that made the steam above the pool look almost solid. Somewhere in the room, two men were arguing about something that would not matter by tomorrow. The water was waiting. He went in.
There is a letter written by the Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca, dating to sometime around 50 A.D., in which he describes in considerable and increasingly irritated detail the sounds that reach him through the walls of his apartment, which happens to be located directly above a public bathhouse. He describes the grunting of men exercising with weights. He describes the slapping sound of hands on shoulders during massage. He describes the splashing of someone who apparently enters the pool with more enthusiasm than grace. He describes the hair plucker who moves through the bathing halls advertising his services with a particular high-pitched cry designed to carry across a noisy room. He describes the food vendors. He describes the arguments. He describes someone who apparently likes to sing in the bath, which Seneca finds particularly objectionable, noting that the man has a terrible voice and seems entirely unaware of this fact. What Seneca has accidentally given us in a letter that was meant to be a philosophical meditation on the difficulty of achieving inner peace in a noisy city is a remarkably precise account of what a Roman bathhouse actually sounded like from the outside, which gives us a reasonable basis for imagining what it sounded like from the inside. Loud, continuous, human in every sense of that word. The Roman bathhouse was not a quiet place. It was not a place of meditative stillness and hushed reverence. It was a place where thousands of people were doing ordinary things in close proximity to one another, and ordinary things done by thousands of people in close proximity produce a noise level that Seneca, who was trying to read Stoic philosophy upstairs, found genuinely difficult to work around. This is where we are going now. Inside, past the entrance, past the apoditorium where you have left your clothes with an attendant whose expression suggests he has seen everything and is surprised by nothing, through the first doorway and into the actual daily life of the Roman bathhouse, which was considerably more complex, considerably more social, and considerably more interesting than the simple act of getting clean. The day at a Roman bathhouse did not begin at the same hour for everyone, because the bathhouse, unlike many Roman institutions, was accessible across most of the afternoon and into the early evening, and different categories of people arrived at different times according to their schedules and their social circumstances. The morning hours were given over to cleaning and preparation, to the stokers who had been up since before dawn feeding the furnaces, to the attendants who swept the floors and checked the water and arranged the oil flasks and the strigils, those curved metal scrapers that were the Roman substitute for soap, in the places where bathers would expect to find them.
The bathhouse did not open its doors to the public until the bathing rooms were properly heated, which took several hours of sustained furnace operation, and the operator who opened before the caldarium was genuinely warm was an operator who heard about it immediately and at length. The first bathers of the afternoon were typically those with the most flexible schedules, the wealthy who had no particular obligation on their time, the students whose teachers had released them, the shopkeepers who had closed for the midday rest and had not yet reopened, and a category of person that Roman sources describe with varying degrees of disapproval as those who simply spent their afternoons at the baths because they had nothing better to do, which the more industrious commentators considered a character failing, and which the less industrious commentators, who were often also at the baths in the afternoon, tended to regard with greater sympathy. The baths in the early afternoon had a particular character, less crowded, warmer in a more controlled way, the pools cleaner than they would be in 2 hours when the full crowd arrived, the noise level at something approaching conversation rather than something approaching a construction site. By the middle of the afternoon, the bathhouse was at its busiest. Workers who had finished their morning labor, tradesmen and craftsmen, and the vast variety of people who kept Rome's economy functioning at the street level arrived in numbers that transformed the character of the place. The pools filled, the exercise courts became active. The changing rooms cycled through bathers in a continuous rotation that kept the attendants perpetually occupied. The noise level rose to the register that Seneca had complained about from his apartment above, and the bathhouse became what it most fundamentally was, a public space in the fullest sense, a place where the city's population gathered in a context that stripped away some of the markers of social distinction that governed behavior everywhere else. The stripping away was literal, which is the part of Roman public bathing that tends to produce the most immediate reaction in people encountering it for the first time. Roman bathing, at least in the mixed or male sections of the bathhouse, was conducted without clothing. This was not considered remarkable, it was simply the practice. The human body, which Roman culture had absorbed from Greek culture the habit of representing in art with great frequency and considerable beauty, was not regarded as an object of shame in the bathing context, and the sight of a large number of unclothed people in a bathing hall was no more surprising to a Roman bather than the sight of a large number of clothed people in a forum. It was simply what people looked like in this particular place, and the bathhouse was one of the places where people looked like that.
The question of whether Roman baths were mixed, meaning whether men and women bathed together, is one that the historical sources answer with considerable inconsistency, which probably reflects an inconsistency in the actual practice rather than a simple answer that some sources have gotten wrong. The evidence suggests that the situation varied by period, by establishment, and by the degree to which the particular emperor of the moment had opinions about public morality that he was prepared to enforce through legislation. The Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD and had a reputation for administrative thoroughness that extended to personal behavior, apparently issued regulations requiring separate bathing for men and women. This suggests that before his regulation, mixing was common enough to require addressing, and that after his regulation, the situation was more controlled, though probably not perfectly controlled, because regulations about behavior in bathhouses are the kind of regulations that are easy to pass and complicated to enforce in a room full of steam and 1,000 people and limited visibility. The larger Thermae typically handled the question by having duplicate facilities mirrored on either side of the central axis, which allowed men and women to use separate but equivalent spaces simultaneously. The smaller Balnea, which often lacked the square footage for duplicate everything, typically managed the question through time allocation, with women bathing in the morning before the male crowd arrived, or alternatively in the early evening before closing, and men bathing through the main afternoon hours. This arrangement was practical and widely understood, though the hours assigned to women were consistently the less desirable ones. The cooler morning hours, when the furnaces had not yet brought the rooms to full temperature, or the evening hours when the pools were at their least clean, which tells you something about whose convenience the scheduling was optimized for. That requires no further elaboration. What people actually did inside the bathhouse once they had arrived and undressed follows a sequence that the Roman medical writer Galen and others describe with the confident precision of people who consider the proper conduct of bathing to be a matter of genuine health importance rather than merely personal preference. You began in the palastra, the exercise court, with physical activity of some kind. Wrestling was popular, and the exercise courts of the great Thermae were large enough to accommodate multiple bouts simultaneously, with spectators standing around the edges offering the kind of commentary that spectators at athletic events have been providing since there were athletic events, which is to say, commentary that combined genuine enthusiasm for the sport with a frankness of assessment that the participants did not always appreciate. Ball games of various kinds were played, including a game involving a small hard ball that seems to have been hit with the palm of the hand against a wall, and a game involving a larger, softer ball that was thrown and caught among a group of players in patterns that the sources describe but not clearly enough to fully reconstruct. Running took place in the longer, straight sections of the colonnaded walkways. Weight training of a sort was practiced, with heavy stone or lead weights lifted in patterns intended to develop the upper body. The purpose of this exercise was not primarily athletic performance, though Roman men did take a genuine pride in physical capability, and the exercise courts were competitive spaces in ways that the bathing halls were not. The purpose, as the medical writers understood it, was to raise the body temperature and open the pores through perspiration, preparing the skin for the cleaning process that would follow. You were supposed to work up a sweat before you got into the water. The sweat, combined with the olive oil that was applied to the skin both before and during the bathing process, and the heat of the bathing rooms, produced on the surface of the skin a substance that the strigil was then used to remove. The strigil was a curved metal implement, typically made of bronze, with a concave scraping edge that could be drawn along the skin to collect and remove this oily residue. It required either a degree of flexibility that not everyone possessed or the assistance of another person, which is why the bathhouse employed a category of attendant, the unctors who applied the oil and the tractors who assisted with the scraping, and why wealthy Romans brought their own slaves to perform these functions, while less wealthy Romans either managed for themselves or paid for the services of the house attendants. The scraping sounds unpleasant in a way that it apparently was not in practice. The strigil, properly used on oiled skin that had been warmed by exercise and heated air, was experienced as something between an exfoliation and a massage, removing the top layer of dead skin cells along with the oil and dirt without damaging the skin below. The material collected on the strigil was not merely discarded. It was, in the establishments that chose to operate this trade, collected and sold. Strigil scrapings from famous athletes, the accumulated sweat and oil of men whose physical performances were publicly admired, were sold as medicines and as ingredients in cosmetics, a practice that the satirists of the period found richly funny and that the buyers apparently found perfectly reasonable, which tells you something about the relationship between celebrity culture and medical credulity that is not entirely unfamiliar even now.
The movement from the exercise court into the bathing rooms proper followed the thermal sequence already described, from the tepidarium through the caldarium and then to the frigidarium, though the order and the time spent in each room varied by individual preference, by the advice of whatever medical authority you were currently following, and by the practical consideration of how crowded each room was at the moment you wanted to use it. The tepidarium was the most sociable room, warm enough to be comfortable but not so hot as to make sustained conversation difficult, and it functioned in the bathhouse as the forum functioned in civic life, as the primary space of informal social interaction.
Business was conducted in the tepidarium, friendships were maintained, political alliances were assessed and realigned. Gossip of extraordinary quality circulated through the warm air with an efficiency that the correspondents of the era noted, and that the targets of the gossip found considerably less charming. The caldarium was too hot for comfortable extended conversation, which paradoxically made it a better space for the kind of honest, unguarded exchange that excessive social comfort tends to prevent. Something about sitting in very hot air with very little clothing in close proximity to another person who is also sitting in very hot air with very little clothing tends to dissolve the social formalities that govern behavior in cooler and more clothed environments. Roman sources occasionally note that important conversations happened in the caldarium, in a tone that suggests the heat was understood as a kind of truth serum, not in any mystical sense, but in the practical sense that social performance is exhausting, and the caldarium made social performance difficult enough that some people simply stopped doing it. What remained was more direct and occasionally more useful. The cold plunge in the frigidarium was the moment that the bathing sequence built toward, the thermal shock that completed the circuit opened by the heat of the caldarium. Roman bathers described the experience of the cold plunge in terms that suggest it was understood as a genuinely significant physical event, a closing and a completion, the body returning to its baseline after having been opened and expanded by the heat. The pool in the frigidarium of a large Thermae was cold in the direct and uncomplicated way that water fed by an aqueduct in a stone building is cold, not gradually cooled by a refrigeration system to a precisely calibrated temperature, but simply as cold as the water was when it arrived from its source, which in a city supplied by aqueducts drawing from mountain springs was cold enough to produce an immediate and involuntary response from anyone entering it. The sounds of the frigidarium were different from the sounds of the caldarium, where the hot room produced the lower, more subdued sounds of people managing discomfort and heat. The cold room produced the sharp, involuntary sounds of people entering cold water, a category of sound that has not changed at all in 2,000 years and that required no translation then as it requires none now. People got into the cold water. They reacted to it. Other people watched and offered commentary. This also has not changed. After the cold plunge, the completion of the full bathing sequence, most bathers returned to the tepidarium or to the changing room, where the process of dressing and departure occupied a more leisurely pace than the arrival had managed. This was the unwinding phase, the period in which the body was returning to its normal temperature and the mind was in the particular state of relaxed clarity that follows physical exertion and immersion. It was in this phase that the food vendors became most relevant. The bathhouse, particularly the great Thermae, had vendors of various kinds operating in and around its perimeter, selling hot food and wine and various drinks to bathers who had worked up an appetite through exercise and sweating, and who were now in a mood that was friendly to the idea of sitting somewhere warm with something to eat and not hurrying. The food available was the food of the Roman street, not elaborate, not expensive, calibrated to people who were hungry and had limited time and limited money. Sausages cooked over charcoal, bread, olives, cheese, hard-boiled eggs, various preparations of legumes that were the staple protein of Rome's working population, wine in varying degrees of dilution because Romans considered undiluted wine the mark of a barbarian and calibrated their water-to-wine ratios according to the occasion and their own constitution. The wine at the bathhouse was typically of the quality appropriate to the neighborhood, which in the better districts meant something reasonably drinkable, and in the less good districts meant something that performed the function of wine in the technical sense without necessarily fulfilling its promise in the experiential one. The massage offered by the tractainers and various specialized attendants who worked in the bathhouse was another layer of the bathing experience that extended the time bathers spent in the establishment and served both physical and social functions. The physical function was straightforward. Muscles that had been worked in the exercise courts and then alternately heated and cooled through the bathing sequence responded well to manual manipulation, and the Roman bathhouse developed a tradition of massage practice that was taken seriously both by the practitioners and by the medical authorities who commented on it. Galen, who was, among other things, the physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and one of the most influential medical writers of the ancient world, had detailed opinions on the correct techniques for pre-bath and post-bath massage, the appropriate pressure for different body types and health conditions, and the specific benefits of each approach. This was not casual opinion, it was professional medical literature, and it was written in the context of the bathhouse as a health institution. The social function of the massage was related but distinct. Lying on a massage table in a bathhouse was an extended period of relative immobility during which conversation was possible but not required, which made it an ideal context for the kind of conversation that benefits from a certain physical remove, from the sense that you are both occupied with something else and therefore can say things you might not say in a more direct social situation. The massage table in the Roman bathhouse occupied a similar social function to the car in the modern world, a context in which the absence of direct eye contact and the presence of an alternative physical focus creates a kind of social permission that more direct contexts do not. Important things were said on massage tables, decisions were reached. The tractator, who heard everything, said nothing. This was the professional requirement and generally the practice.
The bathhouse also contained, particularly in its less reputable iterations and its evening hours, a category of activity that the more elevated Roman sources treat with a combination of condemnation and prurient fascination that suggests they were considerably more familiar with it than they were prepared to admit in writing. The cubicles and less monitored spaces of some bathhouses were used for purposes unrelated to bathing, and the evening hours in establishments that remained open after dark attracted a population whose interest in the facilities was not primarily hygienic. This aspect of the Roman bathhouse was real and was acknowledged, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with the gleeful disapproval of satirists who found moral failing in their fellow citizens a source of professional inspiration, and it contributed to the periodic attempts by emperors and municipal authorities to regulate the hours and the conduct of bathing establishments in ways that suggest the regulations were addressed to actual behavior rather than hypothetical scenarios. The hair plucker that Seneca complained about from his apartment was a real figure in the bathhouse's ecosystem, a practitioner of the hair removal services that Roman personal grooming culture required, and that the bathhouse, as a place where bodies were already unclothed and available for inspection and improvement, made conveniently accessible. Roman attitudes toward body hair were specific, and in some respects opposite to the attitudes of later European cultures, with smooth skin being considered more civilized and more attractive, and the removal of unwanted hair being a service actively sought by both men and women. The practitioners who performed this service in the bathhouses used various techniques, including plucking, which is what produced the cry that penetrated Seneca's walls, and also various preparations of depilatory substances, whose ingredients the ancient sources describe, and whose effectiveness the users presumably assessed empirically. The barber was another figure in the bathhouse's surrounding economy, operating in the colonnaded spaces around the building or in dedicated rooms within it, offering shaving and haircut services to bathers who were already in a mood for personal maintenance and for whom the combination of a bath and a shave represented a complete program of self-improvement available in a single afternoon. The Roman barber, like barbers in every subsequent era, was also a source of news and opinion, a position in the social network where information gathered from a wide range of clients could be redistributed to a different wide range of clients, and where the chair in which you sat for the duration of a shave was a position from which you could both receive and transmit the current state of communal knowledge with an efficiency that no other commercial transaction quite matched. The thieves were also real, and they were a persistent problem that the bathhouse operators addressed with varying degrees of success and considerable ingenuity. The changing room, where bathers left their clothing and their valuables, was a natural target for theft in a way that required no particular planning to exploit. You were in the bathing halls, your clothing was in the apoditarium,
The time between your entering the bath and noticing that something was missing was the window of opportunity, and it was a window that Rome's considerable population of professional thieves found well worth climbing through. The paid attendant who watched your clothes was a response to this problem, but the attendant was also a person who could be bribed or who could themselves be the problem, and the ancient sources contain enough stories of bathhouse theft to suggest that the attendant system was a partial rather than a complete solution. Wealthy Romans who could afford to bring their own slaves to the bathhouse and who had enough slaves to leave one in the changing room watching the clothing while the others assisted with the bathing had a practical advantage in this context, as they did in most practical contexts in Roman life. The less wealthy Roman who arrived alone and had to choose between paying for an attendant or taking his chances left his bath either slightly poorer from the attendant fee or occasionally considerably poorer from the theft. And the philosophical literature of the period occasionally uses the bathhouse theft as a meditation on the nature of attachment to material possessions, which is the kind of consolation that is easier to offer when you are not the person whose clothes have just been stolen. By the time the afternoon moved into early evening and the bathhouse began its gradual wind-down toward closing, the population inside had shifted again. The families with children had gone, the workers who had come in the main afternoon rush had mostly bathed and left. What remained was a later crowd, the regulars who liked the bathhouse at this hour precisely because it was less crowded, the people who had arrived late from obligations that had run long, the elderly who moved through the sequence at a pace that the afternoon rush did not comfortably accommodate, and the various characters who inhabited the edges of the bathhouse economy and whose business at the establishment was conducted most easily in the relative quiet of the later hours. The pools in the evening were not at their cleanest. This is a fact about Roman public bathing that the sources acknowledge with varying degrees of concern, and that modern readers tend to find more alarming than Roman readers apparently did, perhaps because modern readers have access to information about microbiology that Roman readers did not have, and that would have substantially changed their assessment of what sharing a large warm pool with several thousand people over the course of an afternoon actually involved. The Romans understood that the pools became less clean over the course of a day. They had various methods of managing this, including periodic draining and refilling of smaller pools, and the continuous inflow of fresh aqueduct water into larger ones. They also had the option of simply not thinking about it too carefully, which is an option that people in every era have exercised when the alternative is giving up something they enjoy, and which the Roman bather, who had been coming to the bathhouse every afternoon since childhood and who had not so far been visibly harmed by it, exercised with comfortable pragmatism of someone whose empirical evidence, however limited, was on the side of continued bathing.
The lamps came on as the light faded. Oil lamps hung from brackets or set in niches, casting a warmer and more intimate light than the afternoon sun through the high windows had provided. By lamplight, the bathhouse looked different. The marble that had gleamed in the afternoon became something softer and more golden. The steam above the pools caught the lamplight and held it in a way that the afternoon light had not. The sounds changed too, becoming lower and more contained, the crowd noise of the afternoon replaced by the more specific sounds of a smaller group of people in a large space, voices carrying further, the echo of water more present, the hiss of the Hypocaust beneath the floor audible in the silences between conversations in a way it had not been audible in the afternoon din. At closing, which came at or shortly after sunset in most establishments, the remaining bathers were encouraged toward the changing room with whatever combination of verbal announcement and pointed extinguishing of lamps the operator found effective. The attendants began the closing sequence, scraping the pools, checking the furnaces, cleaning the floors, preparing the space to begin again tomorrow in the condition that tomorrow's first bathers would expect to find it. The stoker banked the furnace for the night, reducing the fire to a level that would maintain the building's warmth without consuming unnecessary fuel, ready to be built back up before dawn for the morning heating cycle that would make tomorrow's baths possible. The city outside was darker than the bathhouse had been. Rome at night was a city of considerable hazard for the person moving through it without either torchbearers or a compelling reason why the hazard was worth accepting. The bathers who left as the lamps went out moved through the evening streets with the particular combination of physical contentment and practical alertness that the Roman city at night required. Clean, warm, somewhat tired, somewhat hungry, carrying the particular ease of a body that has been properly used and properly maintained. The day had included the bath, which meant the day had included something that worked. Tomorrow it would be open again. The furnaces would burn. The water would run. The tepidarium would be warm and full of people with opinions about everything. The pie in the dome, or the Roman equivalent of whatever was sitting under glass in the bathhouse's food area, would be there waiting. You would go back. Obviously, you would go back. Where else would you go? There is a particular kind of invisibility that belongs to people whose work is most essential in places where other people are most visibly at leisure. The man who keeps the swimming pool clean so that other people can swim in it. The woman who restocks the towels in the gym changing room so that other people can dry themselves after their workout. The person who empties the bins in the park so that other people can enjoy the park without thinking about what happens to the things they discard in it. This invisibility is not accidental and it is not natural. It is a social arrangement, maintained by a combination of economic necessity and collective agreement not to look too carefully at the labor that makes comfort possible. The Roman bathhouse ran on this kind of invisibility with a thoroughness and a scale that makes the modern version look almost considerate by comparison. The great Thermae of Rome were staffed by hundreds of workers whose daily reality was as far from the experience of the bathers above them as the hot air circulating beneath the Hypocaust floor was from the warm marble on which senators rested their feet and discussed philosophy. Understanding who these people were, what they did, and what their days actually consisted of is the only honest way to understand what the Roman bathhouse actually was, as opposed to what it looked like from the comfortable side of the caldarium pool. Begin at the bottom, which in the case of the Roman bathhouse was literally at the bottom, beneath the floor, in the stokehole. The prefurnium was the furnace room, a low, hot, smoke-filled chamber adjacent to the bathing block where the furnaces that fed the hypocaust system were located. The workers who staffed these furnaces, who fed them continuously through the operating hours of the bathhouse and managed their output with the judgment and experience that keeping several thousand square meters of marble floor at a consistent, comfortable temperature required, were at the absolute base of the bathhouse's social hierarchy. They were almost always slaves. In a city whose economy was built on slave labor to a degree that is difficult to fully absorb from the distance of 2,000 years, the furnace workers of the Roman bathhouse were among the least considered of a category of people whose consideration was already minimal. Their day began before anything else began. The Hypocaust system required several hours of sustained heating before the bathing rooms above reached the temperatures that bathers expected to find when they arrived in the early afternoon. This meant that the furnace workers were at their stations before dawn, feeding wood into the prefurnium in the darkness while the rest of the city was engaged in whatever the night had offered them, which in the case of people who worked furnaces before dawn was generally not much beyond sleep. The wood was heavy, the space was low, the heat was immediate and absolute. A furnace room attached to a working hypocaust system was not a comfortable place to spend 8 hours. It was a place of serious physical difficulty, of the kind of sustained heat exposure that produces effects on the human body that the workers experienced daily, and that the people walking on the warm marble above them never thought about at all. The fuel management was not simple, which is worth stating because it is easy to dismiss the furnace worker's job as merely physical, as the application of muscle to a straightforward task, when in fact it required a continuous and practiced judgment that cannot be reduced to mere strength. The Hypocaust system was sensitive to the rate and consistency of heat input in ways that were not intuitive and not forgiving. Too much heat too quickly could produce uneven floor temperatures that bathers would notice and complain about. Too little heat at critical periods would allow the rooms to cool in ways that were difficult to recover from quickly.
The transition between the different temperature zones of the bathing sequence, the tepidarium at one temperature, the caldarium at a considerably higher one, required different heat inputs managed through different furnace arrangements, and the worker who understood his furnace system well enough to maintain these distinctions through a full afternoon of bathing was a worker of genuine practical skill, even if nobody in the bathing halls above him would ever know his name or think to ask it.
The smoke was the other constant in the stoke hole. Roman furnaces burning wood produced smoke in quantities that the praefurnium's ventilation arrangements, which were functional but not generous, did not fully manage. The furnace worker spent his day in an environment that would alarm a modern occupational health inspector, and that the Romans dressed with the practical resignation of people who understood that certain jobs produced certain conditions, and that the people doing those jobs were not in a position to negotiate alternative arrangements. Chronic respiratory problems in Roman slaves in certain occupations were real and documented in ways that suggest they were understood by Roman medical writers, even if the understanding did not produce any particular change in the conditions that caused them. The furnace workers coughed. They came out of the stoke hole at the end of the day carrying the smell of smoke in their hair and their skin in a way that no amount of available washing entirely removed. Tomorrow, they went back in. The water supply workers occupied a different category of labor, equally essential and somewhat less brutal in its immediate physical conditions, but no less invisible in the social accounting of the bathhouse. The aqueduct water that fed the pools and the pipes and the various water features of the great Thermae arrived at the complex through a system of distribution that required constant monitoring and periodic maintenance, and the workers who performed this monitoring and maintenance were specialists of a kind that the Roman water supply system had developed over centuries of managing infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. A leak in the distribution pipes beneath the bathhouse complex could drain water intended for the pools into the foundations, producing damp that damaged the hypocaust system and the building structure simultaneously. A blockage in the inflow pipes could reduce the water pressure in the pools to levels that bathers found inadequate and that the bathhouse management found professionally embarrassing. The workers who prevented these things from happening were doing skilled technical work in conditions that required both practical knowledge and physical effort, and they were doing it in the parts of the building that nobody visited for pleasure. The cleaning staff of a large Thermae were numerous because a building processing several thousand bathers a day generated a quantity of mess that required a correspondingly serious cleaning operation. The pools needed skimming and periodic draining. The floors needed mopping, and in the case of the marble sections, needed mopping with the care appropriate to a material that damaged easily with the wrong substance or the wrong technique. The changing rooms generated a continuous supply of the incidental debris of human occupation, dropped belongings, spilled oil, the various small material consequences of large numbers of people moving through a space with their attention elsewhere. The latrines, which were present in the large Thermae as a practical necessity, and which functioned on the same flowing water principle as the rest of Rome's sanitation infrastructure, required regular attention of a kind that was essential to the functioning of the establishment, and that the people performing it occupied the lowest rung of even the cleaning hierarchy. The attendants who worked directly with bathers occupied a somewhat higher social position than the furnace workers and the cleaning staff because they operated in the visible portion of the bathhouse, and their work brought them into direct contact with the customers, which required a different category of skill and produced a different category of working conditions. The opoditarium attendant who watched over bathers' clothing needed to be trustworthy in a context where trustworthiness was difficult to verify, and where the temptation to be otherwise was constant and the supervision was limited. The oil attendants who applied olive oil to bathers before exercise needed to know what they were doing with their hands, which is a skill that requires training and practice and that not everyone possesses naturally. The strigil assistants who helped bathers with the scraping process needed the physical dexterity and the interpersonal composure to perform an intimate physical service on strangers without making anyone uncomfortable, which is a more demanding social task than it might initially appear. These attendants were sometimes slaves owned by the bathhouse operator and sometimes free laborers hired on terms that were marginally better than slavery without being entirely unlike it in their practical experience. The distinction between a slave performing a job at an owner's direction and a free laborer performing the same job under an employer's instruction was legally significant in Roman law and practically blurry in the actual daily lives of the people involved, particularly when the free laborer's economic circumstances left them with limited alternatives to the employment they had, and when the employer's behavior reflected an understanding of this limitation that was not always to the employee's advantage. The unctors, who performed the oil application service, occupied a position in the bathhouse hierarchy that was slightly elevated from the general attendant class because the physical skill their work required. Applying oil correctly before exercise was not a simple matter of pouring and spreading. It required an understanding of how oil should be applied to different parts of the body for different types of exercise, how much to use to achieve the desired effect without waste, and how to perform the application in a way that was efficient and professional rather than awkward or uncomfortable. The unctors who were good at this were valued, and in the larger Thermae, the best practitioners could develop a clientele of regular customers who requested their specific services and who tipped accordingly, which in an economy where tips were one of the primary mechanisms by which workers in the service sector could improve their material circumstances, was a meaningful consideration.
The tractators who performed the massage services were at the top of the direct service worker hierarchy because massage was the most skilled of the physical services the bathhouse provided, the most explicitly medical in its framing, and the most socially intimate in its execution. A good tractator who understood the techniques that Galen and other medical authorities described and who could apply them with the sensitivity and the precision that distinguishing a therapeutic massage from an uncomfortable one required, was a worker of genuine professional distinction, and in the establishments that attracted wealthy clientele, the best massage practitioners could achieve a social position and an economic condition that was considerably better than the rest of the bathhouse's service workforce. There are records of skilled masseurs in the Roman period who were freed from slavery specifically because their skills were valuable enough that their owners could charge more for their services as nominally free professionals than they could extract from them as slaves, which is a form of economic reasoning that says something clarifying about the Roman institution of slavery and the circumstances under which it was modified. The bath manager, the balneator in the smaller establishments, or the procurator balnearum in the larger imperial Thermae, occupied the top of the bathhouse's internal hierarchy, responsible for the operation of the entire facility, for the management of its workforce, for the quality of its water and its facilities, and for its profitability, or in the case of the imperial Thermae, for its performance within the budget allocated by the imperial administration. The balneator of a neighborhood balnea was typically either the owner or a trusted freedman employed by the owner, a person of modest social standing but real practical authority within their domain, which extended to hiring and firing the attendants, setting the admission price within the limits established by convention and regulation, managing the supply of oil and fuel and water, and dealing with the continuous low-level difficulties that the operation of a public facility serving a large number of people inevitably produced. The social life within the bathhouse workforce reproduced in miniature the social hierarchy of Rome at large, which is to say it was rigidly stratified, extensively unfair, occasionally transcended by individual talent or circumstance, and maintained by a combination of economic necessity and social convention that was rarely examined directly by the people whose lives it governed. The furnace worker and the tractator occupied the same building and contributed equally to its functioning, and lived in worlds that had almost no contact with each other, mediated as they were by the physical structure of the building itself, which put the hot and difficult work underground and the skilled and visible work at floor level, and by the social structure of the institution, which valued proximity to the bather and invisibility of the labor in a ratio that had nothing to do with the actual difficulty or importance of the work involved. The social hierarchy of the bathers themselves was a separate and parallel system that operated according to different rules. The bathhouse was genuinely more egalitarian than most Roman public spaces, in the sense that a senator and a carpenter could end up in the same pool at the same time without anyone finding this remarkable. The pool did not care about social class. The tepidarium did not have a section for equestrians and a different section for plebeians. The strigil worked the same way on skin regardless of whose skin it was. This physical democracy, limited and imperfect as it was one of the genuine distinguishing features of the Roman bathhouse as a social institution, and one of the things that contemporary observers noted with varying degrees of admiration and discomfort, depending on where they sat in the social hierarchy being temporarily dissolved. But the physical democracy of the pool did not extend very far beyond the pool itself. The wealthy Roman who arrived at the Thermae came with a retinue that immediately re-established his social position in the context of the bathing experience. He had slaves to carry his oil flask and his strigil and his towels and his fresh clothing for after the bath. He had a slave to watch his clothing in the changing room so that he did not need to pay the attendant fee or take his chances with theft. He had a slave to assist with the strigil, which meant he did not need to rely on the house tractators and could have the procedure done with the personal familiarity and the physical attention to his specific body that a slave who had been performing this service for years could provide. He had, if he was sufficiently wealthy and sufficiently status-conscious, a slave whose sole purpose at the bathhouse was to walk slightly ahead of him through the crowds and clear a path to the pool, which is the kind of logistical extravagance that becomes thinkable when human labor is cheap enough.
The poor Roman who arrived alone and paid his quadrants at the door and found his own way through the crowds and left his clothes in an alcove and hoped they would still be there when he came back, experienced the same pools and the same heated floors and the same moving water as the senator with his retinue. He did not experience the same bath. The senator had time because his afternoon had no other obligations pressing on it. The worker had the time between his morning labor and his evening return home, which was not generous and which was calibrated against the need to eat before the bath or after it or during it from the vendors outside. The senator's oil was the best available. His strigil was bronze and well-maintained. His towels were fresh linen. The worker's oil came from the communal supply available from the bathhouse attendants at a cost that reduced his already small margin. The strigil he might borrow from a friend or manage without. The towel situation was its own ongoing negotiation. The freedmen, the former slaves who had been manumitted by their owners and who occupied a legally intermediate position in Roman society, full citizens but socially marked by their origin in a way that never entirely disappeared, were numerous in the bathhouse both as workers and as bathers. The bathhouse was one of the spaces in Roman social life where the freedman's status was most ambiguous, where the legal category of citizen applied, but the social category of former slave remained visible to people who knew or could infer it. A successful freedman who had accumulated wealth through trade or through the continuation of the business relationship with his former owner, which was the most common path to freedman prosperity, might attend the same bathhouse as his former owner and encounter him in the tepidarium with the particular social complexity of a relationship that had changed its legal character without fully changing its human one. The soldiers stationed in Rome occupied their own social category in the bathhouse and their own practical space because the major military barracks complexes of the Imperial period included their own bathing facilities, which the soldiers were expected to use and which separated them from the civilian bathing population for most purposes. But soldiers on leave or soldiers stationed in posts without dedicated bathing facilities used the public Thermae, and their presence in the bathing halls introduced a social dynamic that the civilian bathers managed with the pragmatic alertness of people who understood that the men in the pool with them were professionally trained in violence and were better left undisturbed in their enjoyment of the warm water.
The wealthy women who came to the bathhouse in the hours designated for female bathing brought their own social hierarchy with them, replicated in female terms the same structure of slaves and attendants and status markers that the men brought, and existed in the bathhouse's social world in a way that the sources, written almost entirely by men, document less fully than the male bathing experience. What we know suggests that the social dynamics of female bathing reproduced the essential features of the male version, the egalitarian fiction of shared water combined with the practical reality of differential resources and differential access, the gossip and the social assessment, and the business of maintaining appearances that was the continuous work of wealthy Roman women in any social context, the particular intimacy of a space in which physical presentation was both unavoidable and consequential. The slaves who accompanied their owners to the bathhouse existed in a social space that had no precise name in Roman legal or social vocabulary because it was not quite a space at all. They were present in the bathhouse as extensions of their owners' domestic arrangements, not as bathers in the full sense, not as workers employed by the establishment, but as mobile pieces of private property performing private functions in a public space. The slave who stood in the apoditarium watching his owner's clothing for the duration of the bath was having an afternoon that was neither working nor not working, neither inside the social world of the bathhouse nor outside it, present in the physical space and absent from the social one in a way that was the fundamental condition of Roman slavery expressed in a specific and particularly visible context. He watched the clothing, he watched the people, he was not watched. The hair plucker whom Seneca heard from his apartment above was a free practitioner, a specialist who worked in the bathhouse not as an employee of the establishment, but as an independent operator who paid a fee to the bathhouse management for the right to practice his trade in their space, which was a common arrangement for the various specialists who made the bathhouse their professional home. The barbers worked on the same basis. The food vendors who occupied the spaces around and sometimes within the Thermae paid for their positions and ran their own businesses within the larger commercial ecosystem of the bathing complex. The bathhouse management collected these fees as part of the total revenue stream of the operation, which in a large Thermae with hundreds of daily vendors and practitioners represented a significant income that partially offset the enormous costs of maintaining the facility.
The physician was an occasional presence in the bathhouse, and his presence there tells you something about how the Romans understood the institution. Medical writers, including Galen, made recommendations about how sick people should use the baths and which features of the bathing experience were beneficial for specific conditions. The warm air of the tepidarium was recommended for certain respiratory complaints, which is a recommendation that the modern reader encounters with some ambivalence, given what we now know about what else was in that warm air. The cold plunge was recommended for certain circulatory conditions. The massage was extensively prescribed for almost everything. The bathhouse in the Roman medical imagination was not merely a hygiene facility, but a therapeutic one, a place where the careful use of its various features could contribute to the maintenance and restoration of health, which is why physicians visited their patients there, and why the bathhouse positioned itself, in the marketing terms available to Roman commercial establishments, as a place of health as well as cleanliness. The mathematician of the bathhouse, the person who performed the economic calculation that kept the institution viable, was typically the owner or the owner's trusted accountant, and the numbers they were managing were more complex than the simple admission fee suggested. The quadrons charged at the door was the most visible revenue, but not the only one. The oil sold to bathers who had not brought their own, the fees paid by the independent practitioners, the barbers and the hair pluckers and the food vendors, the charges for premium services, the better grade of massage, the private room for those who could afford to request one, the specially heated water available at certain establishments for an additional fee. Against these revenues, the costs were enormous: the wood to fuel the furnaces, the oil for the lamps, the marble maintenance, the constant small repairs that a heavily used building required, the wages or the maintenance costs of the workforce.
The bathhouse that was profitable was a bathhouse that was managed with the same attention to detail that any successful Roman commercial operation required, and the owners who achieved this were business people of genuine competence, operating in an environment that did not forgive mistakes in the economics for long. At the end of a day in the bathhouse, when the last bathers had gone, and the lamps were guttering, and the furnace workers were banking their fires, and the cleaning staff were beginning the work that would prepare the building for tomorrow, the space contained a silence that it never had during operating hours, a silence made strange by the continuing sounds of the building itself, the movement of water through pipes, the settling of heated stone, the low sound of a fire reduced but not extinguished. In this silence, the building that had held thousands of people was empty of all of them, and the people who remained, the workers finishing their day in the parts of the building that bathers never saw, were the people on whom the entire edifice, the marble and the mosaic and the vaulted ceilings and the warm water and the social world it contained, depended completely and acknowledged almost not at all. They swept the floors, they checked the pipes, they banked the furnaces. They came back tomorrow and did it again. The marble was still warm under their feet when they left. It would be warm again when the bathers arrived. That was the arrangement. It was not a fair one. It was the one that existed. There is a moment in the afternoon of a Roman bathhouse somewhere between the second and third hour of operation when the tepidarium reaches a particular social temperature that has nothing to do with the hypocaust system beneath the floor. The physical warmth is already there, has been there since the furnaces brought the room up to its working temperature before the first bather arrived. But the social warmth, the specific quality of a room full of people who had been there long enough to relax, but not so long as to become restless, who have shed their clothing, and with it some portion of the social performance that clothing requires, who are warm and comfortable, and in the company of people they know or are about to know, that particular social temperature arrives on its own schedule and cannot be manufactured in advance. It arrives when it arrives. And when it does, the tepidarium becomes something that has no precise modern equivalent, a room in which the ordinary business of human society, the exchange of information and opinion and speculation and invention and malice and affection that constitutes social life in any era, proceeds with an efficiency and an intimacy that the Romans understood perfectly and exploited completely. What happened in that room was not merely conversation, it was the daily operation of Rome's most sophisticated information network, conducted without paper, without messengers, without any of the formal structures that the empire used to move official information from one place to another, and doing so with a speed and a reach that the official structures could not match on subjects the official structures would not touch. The Roman bathhouse was where you found out what was actually happening, as distinct from what the official version of events claimed was happening, and the two were rarely identical in a city governed by emperors who had strong opinions about which version of events should circulate, and limited ability to prevent the other version from circulating anyway. Begin with the food, because the food was where the social world of the bathhouse most visibly extended beyond the bathing halls themselves and into the surrounding commercial ecosystem that the great Thermae generated simply by putting several thousand people in the same place every afternoon. The vendors who gathered around the Thermae were not an incidental feature of the experience. They were a structural one, so consistently present and so thoroughly integrated into the rhythm of the bathing day that removing them would have changed the character of the institution as fundamentally as removing the hot water.
The bathhouse, without its surrounding food economy, was a building. With it, it was a neighborhood. The Thermopolium, the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter, was the most common food establishment in Rome, and the great Thermae attracted clusters of them in the way that any location concentrating large numbers of people attracts the businesses that serve large numbers of people. The Thermopolium was a simple operation, a counter with large ceramic jars set into it, the jars filled with prepared foods kept warm by hot water or charcoal beneath them, and a vendor behind the counter who served whatever was in the jars to whoever handed over the appropriate coin. The food in the jars was the food of the Roman working population, legume stews of various compositions, preparations of grain, sauces made from the fermented fish product called garum that was to Roman cooking what salt is to modern cooking, present in almost everything and noticed only in its absence. The sausage vendor was a permanent fixture at the entrance to any busy Thermae, operating a charcoal brazier over which various preparations of ground and seasoned meat in casings were cooked to order, or maintained in a state of readiness that passed for cooked to order, and sold to bathers arriving or departing or simply passing and unable to resist the smell. Roman sausages were numerous in their varieties and confident in their seasoning, containing combinations of pork and beef and offal and spices and preservatives that the Roman palate had been trained over generations to find appealing and that the modern reader should approach with preconceptions. They were served in bread when bread was available, which it usually was because the bread seller and the sausage vendor had long since understood that proximity to each other was good for both their businesses, and they were eaten standing up, in the unhurried way that people who have just come from a warm bath and have nowhere urgently to be eat things standing up, which is to say with considerable contentment. The wine was a constant. Romans drank wine the way that later cultures would drink coffee or tea, as a daily social lubricant whose absence was felt and whose presence was so assumed as to require no particular explanation or justification. The wine available at the Thermae covered a considerable range of quality and price, from the rough and aggressively alcoholic preparations that the working population drank in quantities that the medical writers noted with concern, to the better grades available at the establishments that attracted wealthier clientele and that stocked accordingly. All of it was diluted with water before drinking, because drinking undiluted wine was the mark of a barbarian or an emergency, and the Romans were particular about maintaining the distinction. The ratio of water to wine was a social signal as well as a practical one, with higher water ratios indicating more refined behavior, and lower ratios indicating either a very bad day or a very specific kind of occasion. The food that the wealthy Roman brought to the bathhouse with him was different in kind from what the vendors outside were selling. The practice of bringing food to the bath, of extending the bathing visit into a social occasion that included eating in the company of friends or clients or both, was common enough among the upper classes to generate the specific literary complaints that Romans generated about any behavior they simultaneously practiced and disapproved of. You brought your own food, you brought your own wine, you brought servants to carry and serve it. You found a space in one of the garden areas or the colonnaded walkways and you made an afternoon of it, which extended your presence in the bathhouse and extended your social utility there and blurred the line between bathing and entertaining in a way that the more austere commentators found indicative of moral decline and that everyone else found perfectly reasonable and enjoyable. The social eating that happened in and around the Roman bathhouse was not merely about nutrition, it was about the performance of social relationships, the demonstration of connection and generosity and status that eating together has always provided in human societies. To eat with someone in Rome was to make a statement about your relationship with them, and to eat with someone in the bathhouse, in a space that was simultaneously public and intimate, was to make that statement in a context that amplified it. The politician who bought sausages for the crowd at the Thermae entrance was performing a generosity that everyone in the vicinity witnessed, and that everyone in the vicinity understood was being performed. The patron who hosted a small lunch for his clients in the garden of the great Thermae was managing his social obligations with an efficiency and a visibility that a private dinner at home could not match. The bathhouse was a stage, and the food was one of its most legible props. The political dimension of the Roman bathhouse is something that the historical sources circle around with a combination of acknowledgement and discretion that reflects the fact that most of those sources were written by people who were themselves participants in the political culture they were describing, and who had reasons for being selective about what they recorded.
The bathhouse was a political space of the first order, in a political system that had no formal mechanisms for the kind of informal information exchange and relationship building that the bathhouse facilitated. The Roman Senate met in designated buildings for designated purposes, according to designated procedures, and the decisions it appeared to make in those meetings were often the formal ratification of decisions that had actually been made in the tepidarium the previous afternoon, between men who were warm and relaxed, and temporarily removed from the formality that the official setting required.
The emperor understood this. Every emperor who was politically competent, which was not all of them, but was enough of them to establish the pattern, understood that the bathhouse was a political venue of significance and managed his relationship with it accordingly. The emperor who built a new Thermae was not merely providing a public amenity, he was making a political statement about his relationship with the people of Rome, about his generosity and his ambition, and his understanding of what ordinary Romans valued and his willingness to provide it. The dedication inscription on a new imperial bathhouse, which named the emperor and described the work in terms that combined architectural fact with political flattery in the proportions that Roman public inscriptions always managed, was read by everyone who entered the building for as long as the building stood, which in the case of the Great Thermae meant centuries. It was the most durable form of political advertising available to the Roman emperor, carved in stone rather than chalked on a wall. And it worked in the same basic way that all political advertising works, by associating the provider with the good feeling produced by the thing provided. The opposition politician, the man who was out of favor or building toward favor, or simply maintaining his relevance in the continuous political calculation that Roman public life required, used the bathhouse differently. He came regularly. He made himself visible in a context that was not officially political, and that could therefore not be managed by the people who managed officially political contexts. He was available for conversation in a setting where conversation was expected, and where the rules of political formality did not fully apply. He listened to what was being said, which in the bathhouse was everything that the official version was not saying, and he used what he heard in ways that the official channels could not access. The bathhouse was where the counter-narrative lived, where the version of events that contradicted the official account circulated among people who had their own sources and their own assessments and their own interest in accuracy when accuracy served their purposes. The gossip of the Roman bathhouse was a specific institution with its own rules and its own economy, and it would be a mistake to dismiss it with the modern connotations of the word gossip, which suggests triviality and malice, and the kind of information that is both unimportant and unreliable. Roman bathhouse gossip included all of those things, obviously, because human beings everywhere and in every era produce information that is unimportant and unreliable, along with information that is important and accurate, and the bathhouse produced both in quantities consistent with the number of people moving through it daily. But it also included information of genuine significance, political intelligence, economic intelligence, the kind of knowledge about who was doing what and why that was the essential raw material of Roman public life, and that had no official source because the official sources had interests in managing it rather than distributing it. The man who had just come from a meeting with someone in the emperor's inner circle arrived at the bathhouse carrying information that everyone in the tepidarium wanted and that he was prepared to distribute selectively to the people whose reactions he wanted to gauge, or whose support he wanted to cultivate, or whose opinion he valued. Which is to say, he was doing what people with information have always done in social situations, using it as currency in the ongoing transaction of relationship maintenance. The information moved from him to the people he told, and from those people to the people they told, modified slightly at each transmission in the ways that information is always modified in human transmission, shaded by the interests and interpretations of each person who passed it along, until by the end of the afternoon it had reached people who were several degrees of separation from the original source, and who were receiving a version of it that bore some relationship to what had actually happened in that meeting, and some relationship to what each person in the chain had found convenient or interesting or useful to emphasize.
This was not uniquely Roman. This is how information moves in any social system that lacks formal mechanisms for its distribution. What was Roman was the specific venue in which it happened, and the specific social mixing that the venue made possible. The bathhouse brought together people who in other contexts did not easily mix: the senator and the wealthy merchant, the successful freedman and the minor official, the military man on leave and the intellectual who had never held a weapon, and it brought them together in a physical context that reduced some of the social barriers that kept them separate elsewhere. The result was an information network of extraordinary reach and density, one that connected the formal political world to the commercial world, to the intellectual world, to the military world, through the shared medium of warm water and conversation. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century A.D., used the bathhouse as a setting for several of his most pointed observations about Roman social life, which tells you something about what the bathhouse meant as a social space and what it made visible about Roman society that other settings kept hidden. Juvenal's Romans at the bath are performing, always performing, their wealth or their poverty, their social connections or their social aspirations, their health or their pretense of health, their virtue or its opposite. The bathhouse in Juvenal is a place where Romans claimed to be, and what they actually were was most entertainingly on display, which is exactly the kind of venue a satirist requires, and which the bathhouse provided in abundance.
The physical nakedness of the bathhouse was a social nakedness as well, which is the point that Juvenal keeps returning to from different angles. You could tell a great deal about a man at the bath that his clothing normally concealed. His physical condition, obviously, but also his social condition, which the accessories and the retinue and the quality of his oil flask and the deference or the lack of deference with which the attendants treated him, all communicated with the unambiguous directness of a space where the usual markers of status had been temporarily removed and replaced with subtler ones that the experienced observer could read as easily as the obvious ones. The man who arrived with 3 slaves and a personal oil-bearer, and who was greeted by name by the bathhouse manager, was a man of standing, whatever he happened to be wearing or not wearing. The man who arrived alone and paid his quadrans and went to find a space in the crowded changing room was a different kind of man, and the bathhouse made this visible in a way that the street, where clothing and bearing and the people walking with you told the story, sometimes obscured. The women who came to the bathhouse in their designated hours carried their own social world with them, a world that the male sources describe inadequately and selectively, but that the physical evidence suggests was as socially complex as the male equivalent. The female bathing hours were a social occasion in the full sense, a context in which friendships were maintained and rivalries were pursued and information was exchanged, and assessments of character and circumstance were made with the efficiency that women in the Roman period had developed for the social spaces available to them, which were fewer and more constrained than those available to men, but which were not therefore simple or unsophisticated. The tepidarium during female bathing hours contained a quality of social intelligence that the male bathers who followed them in the afternoon would have found entirely familiar in its intensity, if not in its specific content, because the human drive to know what is happening and why and to what effect and to whom is not gender-specific, and the bathhouse provided the conditions for its expression regardless of who happened to be using the warm water at the moment. The political crisis was a specific category of bathhouse social event that the sources describe in ways that suggest it happened regularly and was managed with the particular combination of public calm and private alarm that Roman public life required from people who were involved in crises but could not appear to be. When news of significance arrived in Rome, which in the Imperial period typically meant news about the emperor's health, or the succession, or a military reverse, or a conspiracy, real or alleged, the bathhouse was one of the first places it spread, because the bathhouse was where the people who heard things first were in the afternoon, and because the bathhouse was a context in which you could gauge the reactions of a large number of people to information without the formality of an official setting that would have required official responses.
You could watch how men responded when they heard the news. You could assess who seemed unsurprised and who seemed genuinely alarmed, and who seemed to be calculating something rather than simply reacting. And these observations were themselves politically valuable in a system where knowing who knew what when was often as important as the information itself. The businessman in the bathhouse was practicing a form of commercial intelligence that required no special equipment beyond the ability to listen and the social skill to ask questions that did not sound like the questions they were. The grain merchant who spent his afternoon in the tepidarium could learn more about the current state of the grain supply from the conversations around him than he could from any official source, because the men around him included people who knew things about shipping and weather and harvest conditions and the politics of the provinces from which Rome's grain supply came, and they talked about these things in the warm room in the afternoon, the way people talk about consequential things when they are comfortable and in company. The information that emerged from these conversations was not organized or systematic. It was the kind of information that requires interpretation and experience to use, which is why the merchant who was good at using it had an advantage over the merchant who was not, and why the afternoon at the bathhouse was, for serious commercial operators, working time in a social disguise. The philosopher who came to the bathhouse had been doing so since the bathhouse became an institution, and the relationship between philosophical discourse and bathing had been established long enough before the Roman period that it had become something close to a cliché, the great thinker discoursing on matters of deep importance to his students or his admirers while standing in warm water. The Stoic philosopher in the tepidarium was a recognizable type in Roman satirical writing, which suggests he was a recognizable presence in the actual tepidarium as well, a man whose conversation moved with suspicious speed from the practical to the theoretical, and who seemed to find in every practical observation an opportunity to make a point about the nature of the good life that his audience had not specifically requested but was going to receive regardless. The bathhouse tolerated the philosopher the way it tolerated most things that generated interesting noise without disturbing the essential business of bathing and conversation, which is to say with the comprehensive indifference of a space that had seen everything and was surprised by nothing.
The religious dimension of the bathhouse was present, but not dominant, which reflects the Roman ability to keep different categories of experience in their appropriate containers without allowing them to contaminate each other in either direction. The great Thermae contained shrines, small religious installations dedicated to the gods most relevant to bathing and health, primarily Fortuna and Salus, fortune and health, whose favor was worth soliciting in a context where both were visibly at stake. The bather who paused at the shrine on entering or leaving the bathhouse was not performing a deeply felt religious act in most cases. He was performing the kind of routine acknowledgement of divine attention that Romans made in most public contexts, the religious equivalent of touching wood, present and genuine, and not particularly reflective. The gods noted it. The bather moved on. The tepidarium was warm, and the afternoon was not getting any longer. The intellectual culture that the great Thermae supported through their libraries was real and was used, though the evidence suggests it was used by a minority of bathers who were already readers and who found the library a convenient addition to an afternoon already devoted to self-improvement, rather than by a majority who were converted to reading by the presence of a library in their bathing complex. The reading rooms of the baths of Caracalla and the baths at Diocletian were serious spaces, quiet by the standards of the surrounding building, furnished with the reading niches and the writing services that serious reading required, and stocked with the kind of collection that reflected the intellectual ambitions of an institution that wanted to present itself as a place for the improvement of the whole person. The man who spent an hour in the library between his exercise and his bath was a man who took the full program of the Thermae seriously, and the fact that such men existed and that the libraries served them is worth recording, even if the majority of the bathhouse's daily users had no particular interest in improving their Greek or consulting Galen's latest treatise on the management of fever.
The music that sometimes accompanied the bathing experience was a subject on which Seneca had opinions, expressed in the same letter in which he complained about the hair plucker's cry and the general noise level of the establishment beneath his apartment. The man who sang in the bath, whom Seneca found particularly objectionable, was apparently not unusual enough to require comment beyond the quality of his voice, which suggests that singing in the bath was a recognized, if not universally appreciated practice. Professional musicians performed in some of the larger establishments, particularly in the gardens and the colonnaded walkways, where their sound could be heard without overwhelming the more intimate conversations happening in the bathing halls. The music was the kind of background presence that the bathhouse accommodated without centering, one more layer in the sensory texture of the afternoon, present and pleasant, or present and irritating, depending on the quality of the performer and the disposition of the listener. The argument was the most reliable form of bathhouse entertainment, and the one that required no special provision, no vendor and no performer and no instrument, only two people with incompatible opinions and the warm air of the tepidarium to amplify them. Romans argued the way they did everything public, with an attention to rhetoric and a commitment to volume that reflected a culture in which public speech was a valued skill and reticence was not a particular virtue. The bathhouse argument covered the full range of available subjects, political and commercial and personal and philosophical, and it could begin from almost any starting point and migrate rapidly to something considerably more fundamental, because the underlying disagreements that generated Roman public argument were deep and structural and surfaced reliably through the thin membrane of any specific dispute that provided an occasion for them. Two men disagreeing about the price of grain in the tepidarium were often at a level slightly below the explicit content of their words, disagreeing about the nature of Roman society and their place within it, which is a disagreement that could sustain a very long afternoon and that the warm water did nothing to resolve. The ending of the political discussion was as important as its conduct, because in a political system where who you were seen talking to was itself information, the manner of parting from a conversation in the bathhouse was a social act with consequences. The warm handshake, the lingering farewell, the departure in the same direction all communicated something to observers who were themselves being observed. The abrupt ending, the cool nod, the decision to go to a different pool than the person you had been talking to for the past hour communicated something else. The bathhouse was a theater in which every exit was noted by someone, and the Romans, who understood theater at a deep level, knew this and performed their exits accordingly. By the time the afternoon light was failing and the lamps were being lit and the last serious conversations were wrapping toward their conclusions, the bathhouse had done its daily work as a political and social institution, moving information and relationships and assessments and gossip and genuine intelligence through a city that needed all of these things moved and had no better mechanism for moving them. The bathers who left carried with them more than they had arrived with, not just cleaner skin and warmer muscles, but a current account of what was happening in the city that was more accurate and more nuanced than anything the official version would provide, and that would inform the decisions they made tomorrow and the conversations they had the day after that, in the same warm room, with the same combination of reliable sources and unreliable ones, in the same afternoon light that made everything look slightly more significant than it might be, and that Rome, which understood the value of beautiful light on important matters, had arranged for them on purpose. The water was still warm when the last bather left. The gossip, which had nowhere to drain, stayed in the walls.
The end of something that lasted 400 years does not announce itself. It does not arrive on a single day with a recognizable shape. It comes the way most real endings come, incrementally, through accumulation, through a series of small degradations, each of which is manageable in isolation, and each of which makes the next one slightly easier to accept, until one day the thing that existed is no longer quite what it was, and then a little less than that, and then something else entirely, and the people who remember what it used to be are mostly gone, and the people who come after have no precise sense of loss because they have no precise memory of what was there to lose. The Roman bathhouse died this way, not in a single catastrophe, not even in the catastrophe of Rome's political dissolution, which was itself far more gradual and complicated than the phrase fall of the Roman Empire, but in the slow withdrawal of the conditions that had made it possible. The wood supply, the water, the administrative will to maintain infrastructure at scale, the population density that had made 1,000 bathers on a Tuesday afternoon a normal fact of civic life. These things did not vanish simultaneously. They thinned, and as they thinned, the bathhouse thinned with them, until what remained was a memory of something that had been, for 4 centuries, so woven into the fabric of daily Roman life that its absence should have been unthinkable. But the unthinkable, given sufficient time and sufficient pressure, has a way of becoming ordinary. To understand the decline, you need to understand what the bathhouse actually required to function, which is more than the experience of bathing suggested. The great Thermae of Rome were not passive structures that simply existed. They were active consumers of resources on a scale that required continuous management, continuous supply chains, continuous political will. The aqueducts that fed them needed maintenance. The wood that fueled their furnaces needed to be sourced, transported, stored, and fed into fires that could not go out during operating hours without immediate and obvious consequence. The pipes and channels and drains needed repair in a building that processed thousands of people and millions of liters of water every single day. The marble needed cleaning and occasional replacement. The Hypocaust systems, those elegant arrangements of brick pillars and hollow floors and wall channels that had made the whole thing possible, needed periodic inspection and repair of a kind that required the building to be shut down and the floor partially dismantled, which in a building in continuous daily use required both resources and the organizational capacity to schedule and complete the work before too much deteriorated. The 3rd century AD was when the first serious pressures began to make themselves felt, and they were not primarily pressures on the bathing culture itself, but on the broader Roman state that had generated and maintained it. The political instability of the 3rd century, the era of the so-called soldier emperors, produced a sequence of rapid imperial transitions that made sustained long-term infrastructure investment more difficult. An emperor who might be dead within 2 years had different incentives regarding the multi-year construction of a new Thermae than an emperor who expected to reign for decades and wanted his name on something that would stand for centuries. The great imperial building programs that had produced the baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian were products of a particular kind of political stability and political ambition that the 3rd century intermittently lacked. The economic pressures that accompanied the political instability made the maintenance of existing infrastructure more difficult, even as the construction of new infrastructure slowed. The Roman economy of the 3rd century was experiencing a contraction in the money supply and an inflation in prices that made the ongoing costs of bathhouse operation, the fuel, the water, the workforce, more expensive in real terms than they had been in the 2nd century. The smaller neighborhood balnea, which operated on narrower margins than the great imperial Thermae, were the first to feel this. The establishments that had survived on the combination of admission fees and vendor revenues found the balance tipping. Some raised their prices, which reduced their traffic, which reduced their revenues further, which required further price increases, which is the spiral that small service businesses have been navigating unsuccessfully since there were small service businesses. Some simply closed.
The water supply, which had been Rome's most reliable and most impressive infrastructure achievement, began to degrade in the 4th century, not because the engineering stopped working, but because the maintenance stopped keeping pace with the deterioration. The aqueducts were built to last and did last, but they required continuous attention, constant clearing of sediment in the channels, periodic relining of the conduit surfaces, regular inspection and repair of the arches and the underground sections that were subject to seismic stress and ground movement over time. This work, which the Roman state had funded and organized through dedicated administrative structures during the height of the imperial period, became more episodic and less thorough as the administrative capacity of the late empire contracted under the combined pressures of military expense and economic stress. The water still flowed, but it flowed with less reliability and to fewer points than it had in the 2nd century, and the bathhouses that had depended on the certainty of abundant supply found the certainty becoming a calculation.
The Visigoths' sack of Rome in 410 AD is often cited as a symbolic moment in the decline of the Western Empire, and symbolically it was significant, but its practical impact on daily life in Rome was more limited than the symbolism suggests. Rome was sacked, briefly occupied, and then abandoned by the Visigoths, who had limited interest in administering an ancient city and considerable interest in moving on with their military objectives. The city recovered, unevenly and incompletely, and the bathhouses that had survived the event continued to operate because the physical infrastructure was mostly intact and the social habit was deep enough to survive a disruption even of that magnitude. People in Rome were still bathing in public bathhouses in the 420s and 430s, and the fact that the Western Empire was visibly in terminal difficulty did not immediately change the afternoon schedule. What changed it, more durably than any single political event, was the contraction of the city itself. Rome, at its height, had been a city of approximately 1 million people, dense and energetic and perpetually in motion. The Rome of the 5th century was a city in demographic decline, its population contracting as the disruptions of the late empire made the city less attractive as a center of commerce and administration, and as the food supply that had sustained its enormous population became less reliable. A city of 500,000 people needs fewer bathhouses than a city of 1 million. A city of 200,000 needs fewer still. The neighborhood balnea that had served populations dense enough to justify their operating costs found those populations thinning, and with them the economics that had kept them running. The aqueducts were cut by the Ostrogothic forces during the siege of Rome in 537 to 538 AD, during the campaigns of the Byzantine general Belisarius against the Ostrogothic kingdom that had governed Italy since the late 5th century. This cutting of the aqueducts was a deliberate military strategy intended to deprive the city's defenders of water, and it worked in that sense, but its consequences extended far beyond the military situation that had prompted it. When the siege ended and the aqueducts were restored, they were restored incompletely and with resources that were a fraction of what the original maintenance had required. The pressure dropped, the flow rates diminished. The great Thermae, which had required aqueduct branches dedicated specifically to their water supply, found those branches among the last priorities of a restoration effort working with inadequate resources and inadequate organizational capacity. The baths of Caracalla, which had been operating for more than 3 centuries at the time of the aqueduct cutting, fell out of use shortly afterward. The water that had filled their pools in a continuous flow, that had been the physical substance of their social world, was no longer reliably available in the quantities the building required. The building itself remained, enormous and structurally sound in the way that things built from Roman concrete tend to remain structurally sound long past their operational usefulness, but empty. The marble on its floors cooled and stayed cool. The hypocaust beneath it, without a stoker to feed its furnaces, went cold.
The statues in their niches presided over rooms that no longer contained bathers. Only the particular quality of silence that large stone buildings develop when they have been abandoned, a silence that contains the echo of what used to happen there, and that makes the absence feel present in a way that ordinary silence does not. The Church's attitude toward public bathing is a subject that the historical sources treat with more complexity than the popular summary suggests. The popular summary, which holds that early Christianity was hostile to public bathing because of its associations with nudity and sensuality and the kinds of behavior that occurred in the bathhouses' less reputable corners, is not entirely wrong. There were ecclesiastical voices that argued against the bathing culture, that associated the public bath with moral laxity and physical vanity, that suggested that the bath was a place where the attentions of a Christian person were drawn toward the body and away from more spiritual concerns. These voices existed, and they were not quiet.
But they were also not the only voices, and they were not always dominant. Other ecclesiastical authorities took a pragmatic view of bathing, acknowledging its medical benefits and its social role while urging moderation and proper conduct within the institution. The Church did not systematically close the bathhouses it encountered. In the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived the political dissolution of the West as the Byzantine state and maintained urban culture and infrastructure at a level that the West was no longer able to sustain, public bathing continued in recognizable form well past the point at which it had disappeared from the West, and the Byzantine Church coexisted with this practice without the complete opposition that the popular version of the story suggests. In the eastern cities, in Constantinople and in Antioch and in Alexandria, the tradition of public bathing persisted through the Byzantine period and was eventually absorbed and transformed by the Islamic civilization that succeeded Byzantine rule in much of the eastern Mediterranean. The hammam, the Islamic bathhouse that developed in the 7th century and after, drew directly from the Roman bathing tradition, maintaining the thermal sequence and the social character of the institution while adapting it to new religious and cultural requirements. The hammam spread across the Islamic world with the same efficiency that the Roman thermae had spread across the Roman world, because the underlying human needs it served were the same: the need for warmth, for cleanliness, for a social space outside the home and outside the formal institutions of civic life. The hammam exists today, thousands of years after the Roman bathhouse that shaped it, still serving those needs, still providing the thermal sequence that the Romans perfected, still functioning as a space where the social world comes to rest in warm water and steam. The legacy of the Roman bathhouse in the West traveled a different and more interrupted route. The great Thermae of Rome became, in the centuries after their abandonment, quarries for building material, sources of marble and brick and architectural elements that the reduced and impoverished populations of medieval Rome extracted and repurposed for the construction of churches and private buildings. The marble floors that senators had walked on were broken up and burned for lime. The bronze fittings were melted down. The statues were carted away to be used as decorative elements in buildings that had no relation to their original context, or were buried by the collapse of the buildings around them and weighted underground to be rediscovered centuries later by archaeologists who found in them some of the finest sculptures from the ancient world. Michelangelo's conversion of the baths of Diocletian into the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli in 1563 is the most famous instance of this adaptive reuse, and it is famous partly because it was done so well. Michelangelo took the frigidarium of the ancient baths, that vast vaulted space designed to hold thousands of bathers in cold water, and made of it a church whose scale and whose quality of light reflected the original building's character so faithfully that standing inside it today you can feel both things simultaneously, the Roman bathhouse and the Renaissance church occupying the same space in different centuries, each one the legitimate use of a building that was built to last.
The nave of the church is the ancient bathing hall, the vaulted ceiling is the Roman vault, the light that falls through the high windows is the same light that fell on bathers 1,500 years before Michelangelo was born, coming through the same openings at the same angle, in the same quality that Mediterranean afternoon light has always had in that part of the world. Some things persist. The thermal spa tradition of early modern Europe, which developed in the 17th and 18th centuries around the mineral spring towns of Bath in England, Baden-Baden in Germany, and Karlovy Vary in Bohemia, drew on Roman bathing culture both consciously and unconsciously, building on the ruins and the reputation of Roman establishments that had occupied many of the same sites 2,000 years earlier. The city of Bath in England takes its name from the Roman thermal baths at Aquae Sulis, built over the natural hot spring there in the 1st century AD, and the Georgian architects who designed the city's 18th century buildings were working in the shadow of an institution whose form they understood and whose social logic they were, in many respects, trying to recreate. The pump room, the assembly room, the social rituals of taking the waters, all of these reflected a recognition, not always articulated but consistently present, that the Roman bathhouse had solved a problem about how to organize urban social life that was still worth solving in a different century and a different country. The modern spa is the most direct descendant, transformed by private ownership and private pricing into something that the Roman Thermae, with their one quadrans admission and their explicit egalitarianism, would not entirely recognize. But the thermal sequence is there. The progression from warm to hot to cold, the combination of heat and water and bodily attention, the social character of a space dedicated to physical well-being, all of this traces a line back through the hammam and the medieval bathhouse and the Roman thermae to a human need that has not changed because the human body has not changed. You need warmth, you need to be clean, you need a place that is not work and not home and not the formal institutions of civic life. You need somewhere to sit in warm water with other people and have the world held at a small distance for an hour. The Romans built 900 places that did exactly this. We have been trying to recreate them ever since, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of awareness that this is what we are doing.
The archaeological record of the Roman bathhouse is extensive and still growing. New excavations continue to reveal bathing complexes in cities across the former Roman world, from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East, each one a local expression of an institution that the Romans carried with them wherever they went as part of the basic package of what civilization meant to them. The baths at Bath in England, at Timgad in Algeria, at Jerash in Jordan, at Ephesus in Turkey, at Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy, where the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD preserved the buildings in extraordinary condition, all of these tell versions of the same story. The story of a culture that took the daily act of getting clean and made of it something large and warm and social and beautiful and available to nearly everyone, and that understood in doing this that the quality of daily life is not an afterthought to civilization, but one of its primary arguments for its own existence. The mosaic floors of Pompeii's Balnea are still there, the colors still vivid under the volcanic material that covered and preserved them for 2,000 years. The tepidarium at the Forum Baths still has its original stucco decoration intact, the figures and the ornamental patterns painted in colors that have faded but not disappeared, still legible, still present. You can stand in that room and understand, without any particular effort of historical imagination, what it was like to be in a warm room in a well-made building with other people on an ordinary afternoon in the 1st century AD. The room tells you. The warmth the room once contained is gone, but the room's memory of having been warm, the design that was made for warmth, the materials chosen for a context of water and heat and human use are still present in the structure. The room is empty and has been empty for nearly 2,000 years, but it is not quite silent.
What the Roman bathhouse ultimately teaches us, across the distance of 2 millennia and the considerable gap between their world and ours, is something about what it means to take ordinary life seriously. The emperor who built the Thermae did not build a monument to himself, though the inscription on the entrance named him. He built a place for other people to have a decent afternoon. The architect who designed the vaulted ceiling did not design it to impress posterity, though it has impressed posterity continuously for 2,000 years. He designed it because people going to the bath deserved a ceiling that was high enough to make them feel that what they were doing mattered. The stoker who arrived before dawn to light the furnaces did not light them to make history. He lit them because the floor needed to be warm when the first bathers arrived, and if the floor was not warm, the bathers would complain, and the establishment would lose its reputation, and the institution would fail, and the people who needed the bath would not have it. He lit the furnace because the bath was worth having, and because having it required the fire to burn. All of this, the vaulted ceiling and the stoker's fire and the senator's afternoon and the worker's hour of warmth, points toward the same understanding, that the physical conditions of daily life are not trivial, that warmth and cleanliness and the company of other people in a well-made space are not luxuries but necessities, and that a civilization that provides them to its people has understood something important about what civilization is for. The Romans built 900 bathhouses in a single city. They understood. And that, from the Praefurnium to the Natatio, from Agrippa's first grand Thermae to the last lamplight guttering in a neighborhood balnea sometime in the 6th century, is the story of the Roman bathhouse. A fire lit before dawn, a floor made warm, a door opened, someone going in, someone coming out, hair still damp, looking considerably more relaxed than they did an hour ago, and then, tomorrow, the whole thing again. The furnace kept burning for 400 years. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Thank you for spending this night here, in this particular corner of the ancient world, in the warm air of a room that has not existed for 15 centuries, but that is, in some durable sense, still here, still warm, still full of the sound of water and voices, and the ordinary, extraordinary human business of being alive and taking care of yourself and the people around you. Dim the lights. Let the water run a little longer in your imagination before you sleep. The tepidarium will be warm again tomorrow.